Chapter 13 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 13. Alone, and with the deadening depression that had come with Jean's last words, Philip returned to his room. He had made no effort to follow the half-breed who had shamed him to the quick beside the grave of his wife. He felt no pleasure, no sense of exultation that his suspicions of Croisset's feelings towards Josephine had been dispelled. Since the hour MacTavish had died up in the madness of the Arctic night, deep and hopeless gloom had not laid its hand more heavily upon him. He bolted his door, drew the curtain to the window, and added a bit of wood to the few embers that still remained alive in the grate. Then he sat down, with his face to the fire, the dry birch bursting into flame, and for half an hour he sat staring into it with almost unseeing eyes. He knew that Jean would keep his word, that even now he was possibly on the fresh trail that led through the forest. For him there was something about the half-breed now that was almost omniscient. In him Philip had seen incarnated the things which made him feel like a dwarf in manhood. In those few moments close to the graves Jean had risen above the world, and Philip believed in him, yet with his belief his optimism did not quite die. In the same breath Jean had told him that he could never possess Josephine, and that Josephine loved him. This, in itself, Jean's assurance of her love, was sufficient to arouse a spirit like his with a new hope. At last he went to bed, and in spite of his mental and physical excitement of the night he fell asleep. John Adare did not fail in his promise to rouse Philip early in the day. When Philip jumped out of bed in response to Adare's heavy knock at the door, he judged that it was not later than 7 o'clock, and the room was still dark. Adare's voice came booming through the thick panels in reply to Philip's assurance that he was getting up. "This is the third time," he cried. "I have cracked the door trying to rouse you, and we've got a caribou porterhouse 2 inches thick waiting for us." The giant was walking back and forth in the big living room when Philip joined him a few minutes later. He wore an Indian-made jacket and was smoking a big pipe. That he had been up for some time was evident from the logs fully ablaze in the fireplace. He rubbed his hands briskly as Philip entered. Every atom of him disseminated good cheer. "You don't know how good it is to get back home!" he exclaimed, as they shook hands. "I feel like a boy, actually like a boy, Philip. Didn't sleep 2 winks after I went to bed, and Miriam scolded me for keeping her awake. Bless my soul, I wouldn't live in Montreal if they'd make me a present of the whole Hudson's Bay Company." "Nor I," Philip said. "I love the North." "How long?" "4 years without a break." "One can live a long time in the North in 4 years," mused the master of Adare House. "But Josephine said she met you in Montreal." "True," laughed Philip, catching himself. "That was a break, and I thank God for it. Outside of that I spent all the 4 years north of the Height of Land. For 18 months I have lived along the edges of the Arctic trying to make an impossible census of the Eskimo for the government." "I knew something of the sort when I first looked at you," said Adare. "I can tell an Arctic man just as I can pick a Herschel dog or an Athabasca country malemute from a pack of 50. We have much to talk about, my boy. We will be great friends. Just now we are going to that caribou steak." Out into the hall, through another door, and down a short corridor he led Philip. Here a third door was open, and Adare stood aside while Philip entered. "This is my private sanctuary," he said proudly. "What do you think of it?" Philip looked about him. He was in a room almost as large as the one from which they had come. In a huge fireplace a pile of logs were blazing. One end of the room was given up almost entirely to shelves and weighted down with books. Philip was amazed at their number. The other end was still partially hidden in glooms, but he could make out that it was fitted up as a laboratory, and on shelves he caught the white gleam of scores of wild beasts' skulls. Comfortably near to the fire was a large table scattered with books, papers, and piles of manuscript, and behind this was a small iron safe. Here, Philip thought, was the adytum of no ordinary man. It was the study of a scholar and a scientist. He marked the absence of mounted heads from the walls, but in spite of that the very atmosphere of the room breathed of the forest and the beast. Here and there he saw the articulated skeletons of wild animals. From among the books themselves the jaws and ivory fangs of skulls gleamed out at him. Before he had finished his wondering survey of the strange room, John Adare stepped to the table and picked up a skull. "This is my latest specimen," he said, his voice eager with enthusiasm. "It is perfect. Jean secured it for me while I was away. It is the skull of a beaver, and shows in three distinct and remarkable gradations how nature replaces the soft enamel as it is worn from the beaver's teeth. You see, I am a hobbyist. For 20 years I have been studying wild animals. And there—" He replaced the skull on the table to point to an isolated shelf filled with books and magazines. "There is my most remarkable collection," he added, a gleam of humour in his eyes. "They are the books and magazine stories of nature fakirs, the works of naturalists who had never heard the howl of a wolf or the cry of a loon, the wild dreams of fictionists, the rot of writers who spend 2 weeks or a month each year on some blazed trail and return to the cities to call themselves students of nature. When I feel in bad humour I read some of that stuff and laugh." He leaned over to press a button under the table. "One of my little electrical arrangements," he explained. "That will bring our breakfast. To use a popular expression of the uninformed, I'm as hungry as a bear. As a matter of fact, you know, a bear is the lightest eater of all brute creation for his size, strength, and fat supply. That row of naturalists over there have made him out a pig. The beast's a genius, for it takes a genius to grow fat on poplar buds." Then he laughed good humouredly. "I suppose you are tired of this already. Josephine has probably been filling you with a lot of my foolishness. She says I must be silly, or I would have my stuff published in books. But I am waiting till I have come down to the last facts. I am experimenting now with the black and the silver fox, and there are many other experiments to come, many of them. But you are tired of this." "Tired?" Philip had listened to him without speaking. In this room John Adare had changed. In him he saw now the living, breathing soul of the wild. His own face was flushed with a new enthusiasm as he replied: "Such things could never tire me. I only ask that I may be your companion in your researches, and learn something of the wonders which you must already have discovered. You have studied wild animals for 20 years?" "24, day and night. It has been my hobby." "And you have written about them?" "A score of volumes, if they were in print." Philip drew a breath. "The world would give a great deal for what you know," he said. "It would give a great deal for those books, more than I dare to estimate. Undoubtedly it would be a vast sum in dollars." Adare laughed softly in his beard. "And what would I do with dollars?" he asked. "I have sufficient with which to live this life here. What more could money bring me? I am the happiest man in the world." For a moment a cloud overshadowed his face. "And of late I have yet a worry," he added thoughtfully. "It is because of Miriam, my wife. She is not well. I had hoped that the doctors in Montreal would help her. But they have failed. They say she possesses no malady, no sickness that they can discover. And yet she is not the old Miriam. God knows I hope the tonic of the snows will bring her back to health this winter." "It will," declared Philip. "The signs point to a glorious winter, crisp and dry, the sledge and dog kind, when you can hear the crack of a whip half a mile away." "You will hear that frequently enough if you follow Josephine," chuckled Adare. "Not a trail in these forests for 100 miles she does not know. She trains all of the dogs, and they are wonderful." It was on the point of Philip's tongue to ask the reason for the silence of the fierce pack he had seen the night before, when he caught himself. At the same moment the Indian woman appeared through the door with a laden tray. Adare helped her arrange their breakfast on a small table near the fire. "I thought we would be more congenial here than alone in the dining room, Philip," he explained. "Unless I am mistaken, the ladies wouldn't be up until dinner time. Did you ever have a steak done to a finer turn than this? Marie, you are a treasure." He motioned Philip to a seat and began serving. Nothing in this world is better than a caribou porterhouse cut well back," he went on. "Don't fry or roast it, but broil it. An inch and a half is the proper thickness, just enough to hold the heart of it ripe with juice. See it ooze from that cut. Can you beat it?" "Not with anything I have had along the Arctic," confessed Philip. "A steak from the cheek of a cow walrus is about the best thing you'll find up in the big ice box. That is, at first. Later, when the aurora borealis has got into your marrow, you gorge on seal blubber and narwhal fat, and call it good. As for me, I'd prefer pickles to anything else in the world, so with your permission I'll help myself. Just now I'd eat pickles with ice cream." It was a pleasant meal. Philip could not remember when he had known a more agreeable host. Not until they had finished, and Adare had procured cigars of a curious length and slimness, did the older man ask the question for which Philip had been carefully preparing himself. "Now I want to hear about you," he said. "Josephine told me very little. Said that she wanted me to get my impressions first hand. We'll smoke and talk. These cigars are clear Havanas. I have the tobacco imported by the bale, and we make the cigars ourselves. Reduce the costs to a minimum, and we always have a supply. Go on, Philip. I'm listening." Philip remembered Josephine's words telling him to narrate the events of his own life to her father, except that he was to leave it open, as it were, the interval in which he was supposed to have known her in Montreal. It was not difficult for him to slip over this. He described his first coming into the North, and Adare's eyes glowed sympathetically when Philip quoted Hill's words down at Prince Albert and Jasper's up at Fond du Lac. He listened with tense interest to his experiences along the Arctic, his descriptions of the death of MacTavish and the passing of Pierre Radisson. But what struck deepest with him was Philip's physical and mental fight for new life, and the splendid way in which the wilderness had responded. "And you couldn't go back now," he said, a tone of triumph in his voice. "When the forests once claim you, they hold." "Not alone the forests, Mon Pere." "Ah, Mignonne, no. There is neither man nor beast in the world that would leave her. Even the dogs are chained out in the deep spruce, that they may not tear down her doors in the night to come near her. The whole world loves my Josephine. The Indians make big medicine for her in 100 teepees when they learn she is ill. They have trimmed 500 lobstick trees in her memory. Mon Dieu, in the company's books there are written down more than 30 babes and children grown who bear her name of Josephine. She is different than her mother. Miriam has always been like a flower, a timid wood violet, loving this big world, yet playing no part in it away from my side. Sometimes Josephine frightens me. She will travel 100 miles by sledge to nurse a sick child, and only last winter she buried herself in a shack filled with smallpox, and brought 6 souls out of it alive. For 2 weeks she was buried in that hell. That is Mignonne, whom Indian, breed, and white men call L'Ange. Miriam they call La Fleurette. We are 2 fortunate men, my son." A dozen questions burned on Philip's lips, but he held them back, fearing that some accidental slip of the tongue might betray him. He was convinced that Josephine's father knew absolutely nothing of the trouble that was wrecking the happiness of Adare House, and he was equally positive that all, even Miriam herself, were fighting to keep the secret from him. That Josephine's motherhood was not the sole cause of the mysterious and tragic undercurrent that he had been made to feel he was more than suspicious. A few hours would tell him if he was right, for he would ask Josephine to become his wife, and he already knew that John Adare did not know. Miriam was not sick with a physical illness. The doctors whom Adare had not believed were right, and he wondered as he sat facing her husband if it was fear for his life that was breaking her down. Were they shielding him from some great and ever menacing peril, a danger with which, for some inconceivable reason, they dared not acquaint him? In the short time he had known him, a strange feeling for John Adare had found a place in Philip's heart. It was more than friendship, more than the feeling which his supposed relationship might have roused. This big-hearted, tender, rumbling-voiced giant of a man he had grown to love. And he found himself struggling blindly now to keep from him what the others were trying to conceal, for he knew that John Adare's heart would crumble down like a pile of dust if he knew the truth. He was thinking of the baby, and it seemed as if his thoughts flashed like fire to the other. Adare was laughing softly in his beard. "You should have seen the kid last night, Philip. When they woke him, he stared at me for a time as though I was an ogre. Then he grinned, kicked me, and grabbed my whiskers. I've just one fault to find. I wish he was a dozen instead of me. The little rascal! I wonder if he's awake." He half rose as if about to investigate, then reseated himself. "Guess I'd better not take a chance of waking him," he reflected. "If Jean should catch me rousing Josephine or the baby, he'd throttle me." "Jean is sort of a guardian?" ventured Philip. "More than that. Sometimes I think he is a spirit," said Adare impressively. "I have known him for 20 years. Since the day Josephine was born he has been her watchdog. He came in the heart of a great storm, years and years ago, nearly dead from cold and hunger. He never went away, and he has talked but little about himself. See." Adare went to a shelf and returned with a bundle of manuscript. "Jean gave me the idea for this," he went on. "There are 280 pages here. I call it The Aristocracy of the North. It is true, and it is wonderful. You have seen a spring or New Year's gathering of the forest people at a company's post, the crowd of Indians, half-breeds, and whites who follow the trap lines. And you would guess that in that average foregathering of the wilderness people there is better blood than you can find in a crowded ballroom of New York's millionaires. It is true. I have given fish to hungry half-breeds in whose veins flowed the blood of royalty. I have eaten with Indian women whose lineage reaches back to names that were mighty before the first Astors and the first Vanderbilts were born. The descendant of a king has hunted me caribou meat at 2 cents a pound. In a smoke-blackened tepee over beyond the Grey Loon waterway there lives a girl with hair and eyes as black as a raven's wing who could go to Paris tomorrow and say, 'I am the descendant of a queen,' and prove it. And so it is all over the Northland. I have hunted down many curious facts, and I have them here in my manuscript. The world can never sneer at me, for records have been kept almost since the day away back in the 17th century when Prince Rupert landed with this first shipload of gentlemen adventurers. They intermarried with our splendid Crees, those first wanderers from the best families of Europe. They formed the English Cree half-breed. Prince Rupert himself had 5 children that can be traced to him. Le Chevalier Grossier had 9, and so it went on for 100 years, the best blood in England giving birth to a new race among the Crees, and the best of France sowing new generations among the Chippewyans on their way up from Quebec. And for another 100 years and more the English Cree half-breeds and the French Chippewayan half-breeds have been meeting and intermarrying, forming the blood, until in all this Northland scarce a man or woman cannot call back to names that have long become dust in history. From the blood of some mighty king of France, of some splendid queen, has come Jean Croisset. I have always felt that, and yet I can trace him no further than 100 years back, to the quarter-strain wife of the white factor at Monsoon. Jean has lost interest in himself now, since his wife died 3 years ago. Has Josephine told you of her?" "Very little," said Philip. The flush of enthusiasm faded from Adare's eyes. It was replaced by a look that was grief deep and sincere. "Iowaka's death was the first great blow that came to Adare House," he said gently. "For 9 years they were man and wife, lovers. God's pity, they had no children. She was French, with a velvety touch of the Cree, lovable as the wild flowers from which she took her name. Since she went, Jean has lived in a dream. He says that she is constantly with him, and that often he hears her voice. I am glad of that. It is wonderful to possess that kind of a love, Philip, the love that lives like a fresh flower after death and darkness. And we have it, you and I." Philip murmured softly that it was so. He felt that it was dangerous to tread upon the ground which Adare was following. In these moments, when this great bent-shouldered giant's heart lay like an open book before him, he was not sure of himself. The other's unbounded faith, his happiness, the idyllic fullness of his world, as he found it, were things which added to the heaviness and fear at Philip's heart instead of filling him with similar emotions. Of these things he was not a part. A voice kept whispering to him with maddening insistence that he was a fraud. One by one John Adare was unlocking for him hallowed pictures in which Jean had told him he could never share possession. His desire to see Josephine again was almost feverish, and filled him with a restlessness which he knew he must hide from Adare. So when Adare's eyes rested upon him in a moment's silence, he said: "Last night Jean and I were standing beside her grave. It seemed then as though he would have been happier if he had lain near her under the cross." "You are wrong," said Adare quickly. "Death is beautiful when there is a perfect love. If my Miriam should die, it would mean that she had simply gone from my sight. In return for that loss, her hand would reach down to me from heaven, as Iowaka reaches down to Jean. I love life. My heart would break if she should go, but it would be replaced by something almost like another soul. For it must be wonderful to be overwatched by an angel." He rose and went to the window, and with a queer thickening in his throat Philip stared at his broad back. He thought he saw a moment's quiver of his shoulders. Then Adare's voice changed. "Winter brings close to our doors the one unpleasant feature of this country," he said, turning to light a second cigar. 35 miles to the north and west of us there is what the Indians call Michilimackinac, the Devil's Nest. It is a free trader's house. A man down in Montreal by the name of Lang owns a string of them, and his agent over at the Devil's Nest is a scoundrel of the first water. His name is Thoreau. There are a score of half breeds and whites in his crowd, and not a one of them with an honest hair in his head. It is the one criminal rendezvous I know of in all this north country. Bad Indians who have lost credit at the Hudson's Bay Company's posts go to Thoreau's. Whites and half breeds who have broken the laws are harbored there. A dozen trappers are murdered each winter for their furs, and the assassins are among Thoreau's men. One of these days there is going to be a big clean up. Meanwhile they are unpleasant company. There is a deep swamp between our house and Thoreau's, so that during the open water seasons it means that we are 100 miles away from them by canoe. When winter comes we are only 35 miles as the sledge dogs run. I don't like it. You can snowshoe the distance in a few hours." "I know of such a place far to the west," replied Philip. "Both the Hudson's Bay Company and the Reveillon Frères have threatened to put it out of business, but it still remains. Perhaps that is owned by Lang, too." He had joined Adare at the window. The next moment both men were staring at the same object in a mutual surprise. Into the white snow space between the houses and the forest there had walked swiftly the slim, red clad figure of Josephine, her face turned to the forest, her hair falling in a long braid down her back. The master of Adare chuckled exultantly. "There goes our little Red Riding Hood," he rumbled. "She beat us after all, Philip. She is going after the dogs." Philip's heart was beating wildly. A better opportunity for seeing Josephine alone could not have come to him. He feared that his voice might betray him as he laid a hand on Adare's arm. "If you'll excuse me I will join her," he said. "I know it doesn't seem right to tear off in this way, but you see " Adare interrupted him with one of his booming laughs. "Go, my lad. I understand. If it was Miriam instead of Mignonne running away like that, John Adare wouldn't be waiting this long." Philip turned and left the room, every pulse in his body throbbing with an excitement roused by the knowledge that the hour had come when Josephine would give herself to him forever, or doom him to that hopelessness for which Jean Croisset had told him to prepare himself. Chapter 13. Of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 14. In his eagerness to join Josephine, Philip had reached the outer door before it occurred to him that he was without hat or coat, and had on only a pair of indoor moccasin slippers. He would still have gone on, regardless of this utter incongruity of dress, had he not known that John Adare would see him through the window. He partly opened the hall door and looked out. Josephine was halfway to the forest. He turned swiftly back to his room, threw on a coat, put his moccasins on over the soft caribou skin slippers, caught up his cap, and hurried back to the door. Josephine had disappeared into the edge of the forest. He held himself to a walk until he reached the cover of the spruce, but no sooner was he beyond Adare's vision than he began to run. 300 or 400 yards in the forest he overtook Josephine. He had come up silently in the soft snow, and she turned, a little startled, when he called her name. "You, Philip!" she exclaimed, the colour deepening quickly in her cheeks. "I thought you were with Father in the big room." She had never looked lovelier to him. From the top of her hooded head to the hem of her short skirt she was dressed in a soft and richly glowing red. Her eyes shone gloriously this morning, and about her mouth there was a tenderness and a sweetness which had not been there the night before. The lines that told of her strain and grief were gone. She seemed like a different Josephine now, confessing in this first thrilling moment of their meeting that she too had been living in the memory of what had passed between them a few hours before. And yet in the gentle welcome of her smile there was a mingling of sadness and of pathos that tempered Philip's joy as he came to her and took her hands. "My Josephine!" he cried softly. She did not move as he bent down. Again he felt the warm, sweet thrill of her lips. He would have kissed her again, have clasped her close in his arms, but she drew away from him gently. "I am glad you saw me and followed, Philip," she said, her clear, beautiful eyes meeting his. "It is a wonderful thing that has happened to us, and we must talk about it. We must understand. I was on my way back to the pack. Will you come?" She offered him her hand, so childishly confident, so free of her old restraint now, that he took it without a word and fell in at her side. He had rushed to her tumultuously. On his lips had been 100 things that he wanted to say. He had meant to claim her in the full ardour of his love, and now, quietly, without effort, she had worked a wonderful change in him. It was as if their experience had not happened yesterday, but yesteryear, and the calm, sweet yielding of her lips to him again, the warm pressure of her hand, the illimitable faith in him that shone in her eyes, filled him with emotions which for a space made him speechless. It was as if some wonderful spirit had come to them while they slept, so that now there was no necessity for explanation or speech. In all the fullness of her splendid womanhood Josephine had accepted his love, and had given him her own in return. Every fibre in his being told him that this was so, and yet she had uttered no word of love, and he had spoken none of the things that had been burning in his soul. They had gone but a few steps when Josephine paused close to the fallen trunk of a huge cedar. With her mittened hands she brushed off the snow, seated herself, and motioned Philip to sit beside her. "Let us talk here," she said, and then she asked, a little anxiously, "You left my father believing in you in us?" "Fully," replied Philip. He took her face between his two hands and turned it up to him. Her fingers clasped his arms, but they made no effort to pull down the hands that held her eyes looking straight into his own. "He believes in us," he repeated. "And you, Josephine, you love me?" He saw the tremulous forming of a word on her lips, but she did not speak. A deeper glow came into her eyes. Gently her fingers crept to his wrists. She took his hands down from her face, and drew him near to the seat at her side. "Yes, Philip," she said. Then, in a voice so low and calm that it roused a new sense of fear in him, "there can be no sin in telling you that, after last night, for we understand each other now. It has filled me with a great strange happiness. Do you remember what you said to me in the canoe? It was this: 'In spite of all that may happen, I will receive more than all else in the world could give me, for I have known you, and you will be my salvation.' Those words have been ringing in my heart night and day. They are there now, and I understand them. I understand you. Hasn't some one said that it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all? Yes, it is 1,000 times better. The love that is lost is often the love that is sweetest and purest, and leads you nearest heaven. Such is Jean's love for his lost wife. Such must be your love for me. And when you are gone, my life will still be filled with the happiness which no grief can destroy. I did not know these things until last night. I did not know what it meant to love as Jean must love. I do now, and it will be my salvation up in these big forests, just as you have said that it will be yours down in that other world to which you will go." He had listened to her like one stricken by a sudden grief. He understood her even before she had finished, and his voice came in a sudden, broken cry of protest and of pain. "Then you mean that after this you will still send me away? After last night? It is impossible. You have told me, and it makes no difference, except to make me love you more. Become my wife. We can be married secretly, and no one will ever know. My God, you cannot drive me away now, Josephine. It is not justice. If you love me, it is a crime." In the fierceness of his appeal he did not notice how his words were driving the colour from her face. Still she answered him calmly, in her voice a strange tenderness. Strong in her faith in him, she put her hands to his shoulders and looked into his eyes. "Have you forgotten?" she asked gently. "Have you forgotten all that you promised, and all that I told you? There has been no change since then, no change that frees me. There can be no change. I love you, Philip. Is it not more than you expected? If one can give one's soul away, I give mine to you. It is yours for all eternity. Is it not enough? Will you throw that away because my body is not free?" Her voice broke in a dry sob, but she still looked into his eyes, waiting for him to answer, for the soul of him to ring true. And he knew what must be. His hands lay clenched between them. Jean seemed to rise up before him again at the gravesides, and from his lips he forced the words: "Then there is something more than the baby?" "Yes," she replied, and dropped her hands from his shoulders. "There is that of which I warned you, something which you could not know if you lived 1,000 years." He caught her to him now, so close that his breath swept her face. "Josephine, if it was the baby alone, you would give yourself to me? You would be my wife?" "Yes." Strength leaped back into him, the strength that made her love him. He freed her and stood back from the log, his face ablazing with the old fighting spirit. He laughed and held out his arms without taking her. "Then you have not killed my hope!" he cried. His enthusiasm, the strength and sureness of him as he stood before her, sent the flush back into her own face. She rose and reached to one of his outstretched hands with her own. "You must hope for nothing more than I have given you," she said. "A month from to day you will leave Adare House, and you will never return." "A month?" He breathed the words as if in a dream. "Yes, a month from to day you will go off on a snowshoe journey. You will never return, and they will think that you have died in the deep snows. You have promised me this, and you will not fail me?" "What I have promised I will do," he replied, and his voice was now as calm as her own. "And for 1 month you are mine." "To love as I have given you love, yes." For a moment he folded her in his arms, and then he drew back her hood so that he might lay a hand on her shining hair, and his eyes were filled with a wonderful illumination as he looked into her upturned face. "A month is a long time, my Josephine," he whispered. "And after that month there are other months, years and years of them. And through years, if it must be, my hope will live. You cannot destroy it. And some day, somewhere, you will send word to me. Will you promise to do that?" "If such a thing becomes possible, yes." "Then I am satisfied," he said. "I am going to fight for you, Josephine. No man ever fought for a woman as I am going to fight for you. I don't know what this strange thing is that separates us, but I can think of nothing terrible enough to frighten me. I am going to fight, mentally and physically, day and night, until you are my own. I cannot lose you now. That will be what God never meant to be. I shall keep all my promises to you. You have given me a month, and much can happen in that time. If at the end of the month I have failed, I will go. But you will not send me away, for I shall win." So sure was he, so filled with the conviction of his final triumph, so like a god to her in this moment of his greatest strength, that Josephine drew slowly away from him, her breath coming quickly, her eyes filled with the starlike pride and glory of the woman who has found a master. For a moment they stood facing each other in the white stillness of the forest, and in that moment came to them the low and mourning wail of a dog beyond them, and then the full voice of the pack burst through the wilderness, a music that was wild and savage, and yet through which there ran a strange and plaintive note for Josephine. "They have caught us in the wind," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Come, Philip, I want you to love my beasts." Chapter 15 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. After a little the trail through the thick spruce grew narrow and dark, and Josephine went ahead of Philip. He followed so close that he could reach out a hand and touch her. She had not replaced her hood. Her face was flushed and her lips parted and red when she turned to him now and then. His heart beat with a tumultuous joy as he followed. A few moments before he had not spoken to her boastfully or to keep up a falling spirit. He had given voice to what was in his heart, what was there now, telling him that she belonged to him, that she loved him, that there could be nothing in the world that would long stand between them. The voice of the pack came to them stronger each moment, yet for a space it was unheard by him. His mind, all the senses he possessed, travelled no further than the lithesome red and gold figure ahead of him. The thick strands of her braid had become partly undone, covering her waist and hips in a shimmering veil of gold. He wanted to touch that rare treasure with his hands. He was filled with desire to stop her and hold her close in his arms. And yet he knew that this was a thing which he must not do. For him she had risen above a thing merely physical. The touching of her hair, her lips, her face, were no longer the first passions of love with him. And because Josephine knew these things rose the joyous flush in her face and the wonder light in her eyes. The still, deep forests had long ago brought her dreams of this man. And these same forests seemed to whisper to Philip that her beauty was a part of her soul, and that it was not to be desecrated in such moments of desire as he was fighting back in himself now. Suddenly she ran a little ahead of him, and then stopped. A moment later he stood at her side. They were peering into what looked like a great, dimly lighted and carpeted hall. For the space of 100 feet in diameter the spruce had been thinned out. The trees that remained were lopped of their lower branches, leaving their upper parts crowded in a dense shelter that shut out cold and storm. No snow had filtered through their tops, and on the ground lay cedar and balsam needles 2 inches deep, a brown and velvety carpet that shone with the deep lustre of a Persian rug. The place was filled with moving shapes, and with gleaming eyes that were half fire in the gloom. Here were leashed the 40 fierce and wolfish beasts of the pack. The dogs had ceased their loud clamour, and at the sight of Josephine, the sound of her voice, as she cried out greeting to them, there ran through the whole space a whining and clinking of chains, and with that a snapping of jaws that sent a momentary shiver up Philip's back. Josephine took him by the hand now. With him she ran in among them, calling out their names, laughing with them, caressing the shaggy heads that were thrust against her, until it seemed to Philip that every beast in the pit was straining at the end of his chain to get at them and rend them into pieces. And yet, above this thought, the nervousness that he could not fight it out of himself, rose the wonder of it all. Philip had seen a husky snap off a man's hand at a single lunge. He knew it was a creature of the whip and the club, with the hatred of men inborn in it from the wolf. What he looked on now filled him with a sort of awe and fear for Josephine. He gave a warning cry and half drew his pistol when she dropped on her knees and flung her arms about the shaggy head of a huge beast that could have torn the life from her in an instant. She looked up at him, laughing, the inch-long fangs of Captain, the lead dog, gleaming in brute happiness close to her soft, flushed face. "Don't be afraid, Philip," she cried. "They are my pets, all of them. This is Captain, who leads my sledge team. Isn't he magnificent?" "Good God!" breathed Philip, looking about him. "I know something of sledge dogs, Josephine. These are not from mongrel breeds. There are no hounds, no malemutes, none of the soft-footed breeds here. They are wolf!" She rose and stood beside him, panting, triumphant, glorious. "Yes, they've all got the strain of wolf," she said. "That is why I love them, Philip. They are of the forests, and I have made them love me." A yellow beast with small dangerous eyes was leaping fiercely at the end of his chain close to them. Philip pointed to him. "And you would trust yourself there?" he exclaimed, catching her by the arm. "That is Hero," she said. "Once his name was Soldier. 3 years ago a man from Thoreau's place offered me an insult in the woods, and Soldier almost killed him. He would have killed him if I had not dragged him off. From that day I call him Hero. He is a quarter strain wolf." She went to the husky, and the yellow giant leaped up against her, so that her arms were about him, with his wolfish muzzle reaching for her face. Under the cedars Philip's face was as white as snow out in the open. Josephine saw this, and came and put her arm through his fondly. "You are afraid for me, Philip?" she asked, with a little laugh of pleasure at his anxiety. "You mustn't be, for you must love them for my sake. I have brought them all up from puppyhood, and they would fight for me just as you would fight for me, Philip. Once I was lost in a storm. Father turned the dogs loose, and they found me miles and miles away. When you hear the wonderful stories I have to tell you about them, you will love them. They will not harm you. They will harm nothing that I have touched. I have taught them that. I am going to unleash them now. Metoosin is coming along the trail with their frozen fish." Before she had moved, Philip went straight up to the yellow creature that she had told him was quarter wolf. "Hero," he spoke softly. "Hero." He held out his hands. The giant husky's eyes burned a deeper glow. For an instant his upper lip drew back, baring his stiletto-like fangs, and the hair along his neck and back stood up like a brush. Then, inch by inch, his muzzle drew nearer to Philip's steady hands, and a low whine rose in his throat. His crest drooped, his ears shot forward a little, and Philip's hand rested on the wolfish head. "That is proof," he laughed, turning to Josephine. "If he had snapped off my hand I would say that you were wrong." She passed quickly from one dog to another now, with Philip close at her side, and from the collar of each dog she snapped the chain. After she had freed a dozen, Philip began to help her. A few of the huskies snarled at him. Others accepted him already as a part of her. Yet in their eyes he saw the smouldering menace, the fire that they only wanted a word from her to turn them into a horde of tearing demons. At first he was startled by Josephine's confidence in them. Then he was only amazed. She was not only unafraid herself, she was unafraid for him. She knew that they would not touch him. When they were all free, the pack gathered in close about them, and then Josephine came and stood at Philip's side. She put her hands to his shoulders. Thus she stood for a few moments, half facing the dogs, calling their names again, and they crowded up still closer about them, until Philip fancied he could feel their warm breath. "They have all seen me with you now," she cried after that. "They have seen me touch you. Not one of them will snap at you after this." The dogs swept on ahead of them in a great wave as they left the spruce shelter. Out in the clear light Philip drew a deep breath. He had never seen anything like this pack. They crowded shoulder to shoulder, body to body in the open trail. Most of them were the tawny dawn and gray and yellow of the wolf. There were a few blacks and a few pure whites, but none that wore the mongrel spots of the soft-footed and softer-throated dogs from the south. He shivered as he measured the pent-up power, the destructive possibilities of the whining, snapping, living sea of sinew and fang ahead of them. And they were Josephine's. They were her slaves. What need had she of his protection? What account would be the insignificant automatic at his side in the face of this wild horde that awaited only a word from her? What could there be in these forests that she feared, with them at her command? 10 men with rifles could not have stood in the face of their first mad rush. And yet she had told him that everything depended upon his protection. He had thought that meant physical protection, but it could not be. He spoke his thoughts aloud, pointing to the dogs. "What danger can there be in this world that you need fear with them?" he asked. "I don't understand. I can't guess." She knew what he meant. The hand on his arm pressed a little closer to him. "Please don't try to understand," she answered in a low voice. "They would fight for me. I have seen them tear a wolf pack into shreds, and I have called them back from the throat of a wind-run deer, so that not a hair of her was harmed. But, Philip, I guess that sometimes mistakes were made in the creation of things. They have a brain, but it isn't reason." "You mean?" "That you, a man, unarmed, alone, are still their master," she interrupted him. "In the face of reason they are powerless. See, there comes Metoosin with the frozen fish. What if he were a stranger and the fish were poisoned?" "I understand," he replied. "But others drive them besides you?" "Only those very near to the family. 20 of them are used in the traces. The others are my companions, my bodyguard, I call them." Metoosin approached them now, weighted down under a heavy load in a gunny sack, and Philip believed that he recognized in the silent Indian man whom he had first seen at the door of Adare House with a rifle in his hand. At a few commands from Josephine the dogs gathered about them, and Metoosin opened the bag. "I want you to throw them the fish, Philip," said Josephine. "Their brains comprehend the hand that feeds them. It is a sort of pledge of friendship between you and them." With Metoosin she drew a dozen steps back, and Philip found that he had become the centre of interest for the pack. One by one he pulled out the fish. Snapping jaws met the frozen feast in mid air. There was no fighting, no vengeful jealousy of fang. Once, when a gray and yellow husky snapped at a fish already in the jaws of another, Josephine reprimanded him sharply, and at the sound of his name he slunk back. One by one Philip threw out the fish until they were all gone. Then he stood and looked down upon the flat-bellied pack, listening to the crunching of bones and frozen flesh, and Josephine came and stood beside him again. Suddenly he felt her start. He looked up and saw that her face was turned down the trail. He had caught the quick change in her eyes, the swift tenseness that flashed for an instant in her mouth. The vivid colour in her face had paled. She looked again as he had seen her for that short space at the door in Miriam's room. He followed the direction of her eyes. 100 yards away 2 figures were advancing towards them. One was her father, the master of Adare, and on his arm was Miriam, his wife. Chapter 16 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. The strange effect upon Josephine of the unexpected appearance of Adare and his wife passed as quickly as it had come. When Philip looked at her again she was waving a hand and smiling. Adare's voice came booming up the trail. He saw Miriam laughing. Yet, in spite of himself, even as he returned Adare's greeting, he could not keep himself from looking at the two women with curious emotions. "This is rank mutiny," cried Adare as they came up. "I told them they must sleep until noon. I have already punished Miriam. And you, Mignonne? Does Philip let you off too easily?" Adare's wife had given Philip her hand. A few hours' rest had brightened her eyes and brought colour into her face. She looked still younger, still more beautiful, and Adare was riotous with joy because of it. "Look at your mother, Josephine," he commanded in a hoarse whisper meant for all to hear. "I said the forest would do more than 1,000 doctors in Montreal." "You do look splendid, Mikawe," said Josephine, slipping an arm about her mother's waist. Adare had turned into a sudden volley of greetings to the feasting dogs, and for a moment Philip's eyes were on mother and daughter. Josephine was the taller of the two by half a head. She was more like her father. He noted that the colour had not returned fully into her cheeks, while the flush in Miriam's face had deepened. There was something forced in Josephine's laugh, a note that was unreal and make believe, as she turned to Philip. "Isn't my mother wonderful, Philip? I call her Mikawe because that means a little more than mother in Cree, something that is almost undying and spirit like. You will never grow old, my little mother."
Ponce de Leon made a great mistake when he didn't search in these forests for his fountain of eternal youth," said Adare, laying a hand on Philip's shoulder. "Would you guess that it was 22 years ago, a month from to day, that she came to be mistress of Adare House? And you, ma cheri," added Adare tenderly, taking his wife by the hand, "do you remember that it was over this same trail that we took our first walk from home? We went to the chasm."
"Yes, I remember."
"And here, where we stand, the wood violets were so thick they left perfume on our boots."
"And you made me a wreath of them with the red bakneesh," said Miriam softly.
"And braided it in your hair."
"Yes." She was breathing a little more quickly. For a moment it seemed as if these two had forgotten Philip and Josephine. Their eyes had turned to each other. 22 years ago, a month from to day," repeated Josephine. It seemed as if she had spoken the words that Philip might catch their hidden meaning. Adare straightened with a sudden idea.
"On that day we shall have a great anniversary feast," he declared. "We will ask every soul, red and white, for 100 miles about, with the exception of the Roogs over at Thoreau's place. What do you say, Philip?"
"Splendid!" cried Philip, catching triumphantly at this straw in the face of Josephine's plans for him. He looked straight into her eyes as he spoke. "A month from to day these forests shall ring with joy, and there shall be a reason for it, more than one." She could not misunderstand that, and Philip's heart beat joyously as Josephine turned quickly to her mother, the colour flooding to the tips of her ears. The dogs had eaten their fish and were crowding about them. For the first time Adare seemed to notice Metoosin, who stood motionless 20 paces behind them.
"Where is Jean?" he asked.
Josephine shook her head. "I haven't seen him since last night."
"I had almost forgotten what I believe he intended me to tell you," said Philip. "He has gone somewhere in the forest. He may be away all day."
Philip saw the anxious look that crept into Josephine's eyes. She looked at him closely, questioningly, yet he guessed that beyond what he had said she wanted him to remain silent. A little later, when Adare and his wife were walking ahead of them, she asked: "Where is Jean? What did he tell you last night?" Philip remembered Jean's warning. "I cannot tell you," he replied evasively. "Perhaps he has gone out to reconnoitre for game." "You are true," she breathed softly. "I guess I understand. Jean doesn't want me to know. But after I went to bed I lay awake a long time and thought of you, out in the night with that gun in your hand. I can't believe that you were there simply because of a noise, as you said. A man like you doesn't hunt for a noise with a pistol, Philip. What is the matter with your arm?" The directness of her question startled him. "Why do you ask that?" he managed to stammer. "You have flinched twice when I touched it. This arm." "A trifle," he assured her. "It should have healed by this time." She smiled straight up into his eyes. "You are too true to tell me fairy stories in a way that I must believe them, Philip. Day before yesterday your sleeves were up when you were paddling, and there was nothing wrong with this arm, this forearm, then. But I am not going to question you. You don't want me to know." In the same breath she recalled his attention to her father and mother. "I told you they were lovers. Look." As if she had been a little child, John Adare had taken his wife up in his arms and sat her high on the trunk of a fallen tree that was still held 4 or 5 feet above the ground by a crippled spruce. Philip heard him laugh. He saw the wife lean over, still clinging for safety to her husband's shoulders. "It is beautiful," he said. Josephine spoke as if she had not heard him. "I do not believe there is another man in the world quite like my father. I cannot understand how a woman could cease to love such a man as he even for a day, an hour. She couldn't forget, could she?" There was something almost plaintive in her question, as if she feared an answer. She went on quickly. "He has made her happy. She is almost 40, 39 on her last birthday. She does not look that old. She has been happy. Only happiness keeps one young. And he is 50. If it wasn't for his beard I believe he would appear 10 years younger. I have never known him without a beard. I like him that way. It makes him look beastly, and I love beasts." She ran ahead of him, and John Adare lifted his wife down from the tree when they joined them. This time Josephine took her mother's arm. At the door to Adare House she turned to the two men and said: "Mother and I have a great deal to talk over, and we are scheming not to see you again until dinner time. Little Daddy, can you go to your foxes, and please keep Philip out of mischief?" The dogs had followed her close to the door. As the men entered after Josephine and her mother, Philip paused for a moment to look at the pack. A dozen of them had already settled themselves upon their bellies in the snow.
"The Grand Guard," chuckled Adare, waiting for him. "Come, Philip. I'm going to follow Mignonne's suggestion and do some work on my foxes. Jean had a splendid surprise for me when I returned, a magnificent black. This is the dull season, when I can amuse myself only by writing and experimenting. A little later, when the furs begin to come in, there will be plenty of life at Adare House."
"Do you buy many furs?" asked Philip.
"Yes, but not because I am in the business for money. Josephine got me into it because of her love for the forest people."
He led the way into his big study, and added, as he threw off his cap and coat:
"You know, in all the world no people have a harder struggle than these men, women, and little children of the trap lines. From Labrador westward to the Mackenzie it is the land of the caribou, the rabbit, and the fur bearing animals, but the land is not suitable for farming. It has been, it always will be, the country of the hunter. To the south the Ojibway may grow a little corn and wheat. To the north the Eskimo might seem to dwell in a more barren land. But not so, for he has an ever abundant supply of game from the sea, seal in winter, fish in summer. But here are only the rabbit, the caribou, and small game. The Indians would starve if they could not trade their furs for a little flour, traps, guns, and cloth to fight the cold and aid the hunter. Even then it is hard. The Indians cannot live in villages except at a post, like Adare House. Such a large number of people living in one spot could not feed themselves, and in the winter each family goes to its own allotted hunting grounds. From father to son, for generations, the same district has been handed down, each territory rich enough in fur to support one family. One, not two, for two would starve. And if a strange trapper poaches, the fight is to the death, even in the normal year when game is plentiful and fur prime. But every 7th year there may be famine. Here in the north it is the varying hare, the rabbit, that feeds the children of the trap lines, and the marten and fox they trap. And every 7th year there comes a mysterious disease. One year there are rabbits in millions, the next there are none. The lynx and the wolf and the fox starve. There are no fur bearers in the traps. The trapper faces the blizzard and the cold to find empty deadfalls day after day, and however skillfully they may hunt, there is no game for his gun. What would he do but starve, if it were not for the fur trader and the post? Where there is flour, a little food to help John the trapper through the winter? The people about us are not thin in the waist. Josephine has made a little oasis of plenty where John the trapper is safe in good years and bad. That is why I buy fur."
The giant's eyes were flushed with enthusiasm again. He pushed the cigars across the table to Philip, and one of his fists was knotted.
"She wants me to publish a lot of these things," he went on. "She says that they are facts which would interest the whole world. Perhaps that is so. Fur is gotten with hardship and danger and suffering. It may be there are not many people who know that up here at the top end of the world there is a country of forest and stream 20 times as large as the state of Ohio, and in which the population per square mile is less than that of the great African desert. And it's all because everyone must live off the game. Everything goes back to that. Let something happen. Some little thing. A migration of game. A case of measles. The Indians will die if there were not white men near to help them. That's why Josephine makes me buy fur." He pointed to the wall behind Philip. Over the door through which they had just come hung a huge, old fashioned flintlock 6 feet in length. There was something like the snarl of an animal in John Adare's voice when he spoke again. "That's the tool of the Northland," he said. "That is the only tool John the Trapper knows. All he can know in a land where even the trees are stunted and there are no plows. His clothes and the blankets he weaves of twisted strips of rabbit fur are adapted to the cold. He is a master of the canoe and the most skillful trapper in the world, but in all else he must be looked after like a child. He is still largely one of God's men, this John the Trapper. He hasn't any measurements of value. He doesn't know what the dollar means. He measures his wealth in skins. And when he trades, the basis for whatever mental calculations he may make is in the form of lead bullets taken from one tin pan and transferred to another. He doesn't keep track of figures. He trusts alone to the white man's word, and only those who understand him, who have dealt with him for years, can be trusted not to take advantage of his faith. That's why I buy fur, to give John his chance to live." Adare laughed and ran a hand through his shaggy hair as if rousing himself from thought of a relentless struggle. "But this isn't working on my foxes, is it? On second thought, I think I shall postpone that until tomorrow, Philip. I have promised Miriam that I will have Metoosin trim my hair and beard before dinner. Shall I send him to you?" "A haircut would be a treat," said Philip, rising. He was surprised at the sudden change in the other's mood, but he was not sorry Adare had given him the opportunity to go. He had planned to say other things to Josephine that morning if they had not been interrupted, and he did not believe that she would be long with her mother. In this, however, he was doomed to disappointment. When he returned to his room he found that Josephine had not forgotten the conditions of his wardrobe, and he guessed immediately why she had surprised them all by rising so early. On his bed were spread several changes of shirts and underwear, a pair of new corduroy trousers, a pair of caribou skin leggings, and moccasins. In a box were a dozen linen handkerchiefs and a number of ties for the blue-gray soft shirts Josephine had chosen for him. He was not much ahead of Metoosin, who came in a few minutes later and clipped his hair. When this was done, and he had clad himself in his new raiment, he looked at himself in the mirror. Josephine had shown splendid judgment. Everything fitted him. For an hour he listened for footsteps in the hall, and occasionally looked out of the window. He wondered if Josephine had seen the small round hole with its myriad of outshooting cracks where the bullet had pierced the glass. He made up his mind that she had not, for no one could mistake it, and she would have surely spoken to him of it. He found that the hole was so high up on the pane that he could draw the curtain over it without shutting out much light. He did this. Later he went outside and found that the dogs regarded him with certain signs of friendship. In him was a growing presentiment that something had happened to Jean. He was sure that Croisset had taken up the trail of the man who had shot at him after they had separated at the gravesides. He was equally certain that the chase would be short. Jean was quick. Dogs and sledge would be an impediment for the other in the darkness of the night. Before this, hours ago, they must have met. If Jean had come out of that meeting unharmed, it was time for him to be showing up at Adare House. Still greater perturbation filled Philip's mind when he recalled the unpleasant skill of the mysterious forest man's fighting. He had been more than his equal in swiftness and trickery. He was certainly Jean's. Should he make some excuse and follow Jean's trail? He asked himself this question a dozen times without arriving at an answer. Then it occurred to him that Jean might have some definite reason for not returning to Adare House immediately. The longer he reasoned with himself, the more confident he became that Croisset had been the victor. He knew Jean. Every advantage was on his side. He was as watchful as a lynx. It was impossible to conceive of him walking into a trap. So he determined to wait, at least until that night.
It was almost noon when Adare sent word by Metoosin asking Philip to rejoin him in the big room. A little later Josephine and her mother came in. Again Philip noticed that in the face of Adare's wife was that strange look which he had first observed in her room. The colour of the morning had faded from her cheeks. The glow in her eyes was gone. Adare noted the change, and spoke to her tenderly. Miriam and Josephine went ahead of them into the dining room, and with his hand on Philip's arm John Adare whispered: "Sometimes I'm afraid, Philip. She changes so suddenly. This morning her cheeks and lips were red, her eyes were bright. She laughed. She was the old Miriam. And now, can you tell me what it means? Is it some terrible malady which the doctors could not find?" "No, it is not that." Philip felt his heart beat a little faster. Josephine had fallen a step behind her mother. She had heard Adare's words, and at Philip she flung back a swift, frightened look. "It is not that," he repeated. "See how much better she looks to day than yesterday. You understand, Mon Pere, that oftentimes there comes a period of nervousness, of a sickness that is not sickness, in a woman's life. The winter will build her up." The dinner passed too swiftly for Philip. They sat at a long table, and Josephine was opposite him. For a time he forgot the strain he was under, that he was playing a part in which he must not strike a single false key. Yet in another way he was glad when it came to an end, for it gave him an opportunity of speaking a few words with Josephine. Adare and Miriam went out ahead of them. At the door Philip held Josephine back. "You are not going to leave me alone this afternoon?" he asked. "It is not quite fair or safe, Josephine. I am travelling on thin ice. "You are doing splendidly, Philip," she protested. "To morrow I will be different. Metoosin says there is a little half breed girl very sick 10 miles back in the forest, and you may go with me to visit her. There are reasons why I must be with my mother all of to day. She has had a long journey and is worn out and nervous. Perhaps she will not want to appear at supper. If that is so I will remain with her. But we will be together to morrow all day. Is that not recompense?" She smiled up into his face as they followed Adare and his wife. "You may help Metoosin with the dogs," she suggested. "I want you to be good friends, you and my beasts." The hours that followed proved to be more than empty ones for Philip. Twice he went to the big room and found that Adare himself had yielded to the exhaustion of the long trip from civilization and was asleep. He accompanied Metoosin to the pit and assisted in chaining the dogs. But Metoosin was taciturn and uncommunicative. Josephine and her mother sent down their excuses at supper time, and he sat alone with Adare, who was delighted when he received word that they had been sleeping most of the afternoon, and would join them a little later. His face clouded, however, when he spoke of Jean. "It is unusual," he said. "Jean is very careful to leave word of his movements. Metoosin says it is possible he went after fresh caribou meat. But that is not so. His rifle is in his room. He left during the night, or he would have spoken to us. I saw him as late as midnight, and he made no mention of it then. It has been snowing for 2 or 3 hours, or I would send Metoosin on his trail." "What possible cause for worry can you have?" asked Philip.
"Thoreau's cutthroats,"
replied Adare, a sudden fire in his eyes.
"This winter may see things happen. The force behind Thoreau's success in trade is whisky. That damnable stuff is his lure, or all the fur in this country would come to Adare House. If he could drive me out he would have nothing to fight against. His hands would be at the throat of every living soul in these regions, and all through whisky. Among those who were killed or turned up missing last winter were 4 of my best hunters. Twice Jean was shot at on the trail. I fear for him because he is my right arm."
When Philip left Adare he went to his room, put on heavier moccasins, and went quietly from the house. 3 inches of fresh snow had fallen, and the air was thick with the white deluge. He hurried into the edge of the forest. A few minutes' futile searching convinced him of the impossibility of following the trail made by Jean and the man he had pursued. Through the thickening darkness he returned to Adare House. Again he changed his moccasins, and waited for the expected word from Josephine or Adare. Half an hour passed, and during this time his mind became still more uneasy. He had hoped that Croisset was hanging in the edge of the forest, waiting for darkness. Each minute now added to his fear that all had not gone well with the half breed. He paced up and down his room, smoking and looking at his watch frequently. After a time he went to the window and tried to peer out into the white swirl of the night. The opening of his door turned him about. He expected to see Adare. Words that were on his lips froze in a moment of speechless horror. He knew that it was Jean Croisset who stood before him, but it did not look like Jean. The half breed's cap was gone. He was swaying, clutching at the partly opened door to support himself. His face was disfigured with blood. The front of his coat was spattered with frozen clots of it. His hair had fallen in rope-like strands over his eyes and frozen there. His lips were terrible. "Good God!" gasped Philip. He sprang forward and caught Jean as the half-breed staggered towards him. Jean's body hung a weight in his arms. His legs gave way under him, but for a moment the clutch of his fingers on Philip's shoulder were vice-like. "A little help, M'sieur," he gasped. "I am faint, sick. Whatever happens, as you love Our Lady, let no one know of this tonight." With a rattling breath his head dropped upon Philip's arm. Chapter 17 of God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. Scarcely had Jean uttered the few words that preceded his lapse into unconsciousness than Philip heard the laughing voice of Adare at the further end of the hall. Heavy footsteps followed the voice. Impulse rather than reason urged him into action. He lowered Jean to the floor, sprang to the partly opened door, closed it, and softly locked it. He was not a moment too soon. A few steps more, and Adare was beating on the panel with his fist. "What ho!" he cried in his booming voice. "Josephine wants to know if you have forgotten her." Adare's hand was on the latch. "I am undressed," explained Philip desperately. "Offer 1,000 apologies for me, mon pere. I will finish my bath in a hurry." He dropped on his knees beside Jean as the master of Adare moved away from the door. A brief examination showed him where Croisset was hurt. The half breed had received a scalp wound, from which the blood had flowed down over his face and breast. He breathed easier when he discovered nothing beyond this. In a few minutes he had him partially stripped and on his bed. Jean opened his eyes as he bathed the blood from his face. He made an effort to rise, but Philip held him back. "Not yet, Jean," he said. Jean's glance shifted in a look of alarm toward the door. "I must, M'sieur," he insisted. "It was the last few hundred yards that made me dizzy. I am better now. And there is no time to lose. I must get into my room, into other clothes." "We will not be interrupted," Philip assured him. "Is this your only hurt, Jean?" "That alone, M'sieur. It was not bad until an hour ago. Then it broke out afresh, and made me so dizzy that with my last breath I stumbled into your room. The saints be praised that I managed to reach you." Philip left him, to return in a moment with a flask. Jean had pulled himself into a sitting posture on the side of the bed. "Here is a drop of whisky, Jean. It will stir up your blood." "Mon Dieu, it has been stirred up enough this night, Taniki," smiled Jean feebly. "But it may give me voice, M'sieur. Will you get me fresh clothes? They are in my room, which is next to this on the right. I must be prepared for Josephine or Le M'sieur before I talk." Philip went to the door and opened it cautiously. He could hear voices coming from the room through which he had first entered Adare House. The hall was clear. He slipped out and moved swiftly to Jean's room. 5 minutes later he re entered his own room with an armful of Jean's clothes. Already Croisset was something like himself. He quickly put on the garments Philip gave him, brushed the tangles from his hair, and called upon Philip to examine him to make sure he had left no spot of blood on his face or neck.
"You have the time?" he asked then. Philip looked at his watch. "It is 8 o'clock." "And I must see Josephine alone before 10," said Jean quickly. "You must arrange it, M'sieur. No one must know that I have returned until I see her. It is important. It means " "What?" "The great God alone can answer that," replied Jean in a strange voice. "Perhaps it will mean that to morrow, or the next day, or the day after that, M'sieur Weyman will know the secret we are keeping from him now, and will fight shoulder to shoulder with Jean Jacques Croisset in a fight that the wilderness will remember so long as there are tongues to tell of it." There was nothing of boastfulness or of excitement in his words. They were in the voice of a man who saw himself facing the final arbiter of things, a voice dead to visible hope, yet behind which there trembled a thing that made Philip face him with a new fire in his eyes. "Why to morrow, or the next day?" he demanded. "Why shroud me in this damnable mystery any longer, Jean? If there is fighting to be done, let me fight!" Jean's hollowed cheeks took on a flush. "I would give my life if we two could go out and fight, as I want to fight," he said in a low, tense voice. "It would be worth your life and mine, that fight. It would be glorious. But I am a Catholic, M'sieur. I am a Catholic of the wilderness, and I have taken the most binding oath in the world. I have sworn by the sweet soul of my dead Iowaka to do only as Josephine tells me to do in this. Over her grave I swore that, with Josephine kneeling at my side. I have prayed that my Iowaka might come to me and tell me if I am right. But in this her voice has been silent. I have prayed for Josephine to free me from my oath, and she has refused. I am afraid. I dare reveal nothing. I cannot act as I want to act. But tonight " His voice sank to a whisper. His fingers gripped deep into the flesh of Philip's hand. "Tonight may mean something," he went on, his voice filled with an excitement strange to him. "The fight is coming, M'sieur. We cannot much longer evade what we have been trying to evade. It is coming, and then, shoulder to shoulder, we will fight." "And until then must I wait?" "Yes, you must wait, M'sieur." Jean freed his hand and sat down in one of the chairs near the table, his eyes turned toward the window. "You need not fear another shot, M'sieur," he said quietly. "The man who fired that will not fire again." "You killed him?" Jean bowed his head without replying. The movement was neither of affirmation nor denial. "He will not fire again." "It was more than one against one," persisted Philip. "Does your oath compel you to keep silent about that, too?" There was a note of irritation in his voice which was almost a challenge to Jean. It did not prick the half breed. He looked at Philip a moment before he replied. "You are an unusual man, M'sieur," he said at last, as though he had been carefully measuring his words. "We have known each other only a few days, and yet it seems a long time. I had my suspicions of you back there. I thought it was Josephine's beauty you were after, and I have stood ready to kill you if I saw in you what I feared. But you have won, M'sieur. Josephine loves you. I have faith in you. And do you know why? It is because you have fought the fight of a strong man. It does not take a great soul in a man to match knife against knife, or bullet against bullet. Not to keep one's word, to play a hopeless part in the dark, to leap when the numa wapi is over the eyes and you are blind, that takes a man. And now, when Jean Jacques Croisset says for the first time that there is a ray of hope for you, where a few hours ago no hope existed, will you give me again your promise to play the part you have been asked to play?" "Hope?" Philip was at Jean's side in an instant. "Jean, what do you mean? Is it that you, even you, now give me hope of possessing Josephine?" Slowly Jean rose from his chair. "I am part Cree, M'sieur," he said. "And in our creed there is a saying that the God of all things, Kisamunito, the Great Spirit, often sits on high and laughs at the tricks which he plays on men. Perhaps this is one of those times. I am beginning to believe so. Kisamunito has begun to run our destinies, not ourselves. Yesterday our Josephine and I, had hopes, our plans, our schemes well laid. Tonight they no longer exist. Before the night is much older, all that Josephine has done, all that she has made you promise, will count for nothing. After that, a matter of hours, perhaps of days, will come the fight for you and me. Until then you must know nothing, must see nothing, must ask nothing. And when the crash comes " "It will give Josephine to me?" Philip cried eagerly. "I did not say that, M'sieur," corrected Jean quietly. "Out of fighting such as this strange things may happen, and where things happen there is always hope. Is that not true?" He moved to the door and listened. Quietly he opened it and looked out. "The hall is clear," he whispered softly. "Go to Josephine. Tell her that she must arrange to see me within an hour. And if you care for that bit of hope I have shown you, let it happen without the knowledge of the master of Adare. From this hour Jean Jacques Croisset sacrifices his soul. Make haste, M'sieur, and use caution." Without a word Philip went quietly into the hall. Behind him Jean closed and locked the door. Chapter 18. God's Country and the Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God's Country and the Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. For a few moments Philip stood without moving. Jean's return and the strange things he had said had worked like sharp wine in his blood. He was breathing quickly. He was afraid that his appearance just now would betray the mental excitement which he must hide. He drew back deeper into the shadow of the wall and waited, and while he waited he thought of Jean. It was not the old Jean that had returned this night. The Jean with his silence, his strange repression, the mysterious something that had seemed to link him with an age old past. Out of that spirit had risen a new sort of man, the fighting man. He had seen a new fire in Jean's eyes and face. He had caught new meaning in his words. Jean was no longer the passive Jean, waiting, watching, guarding. Out in the forest something had happened to rouse in him what a word from Josephine would set flaming in the savage breasts of her dogs. And the excitement in Philip's blood was the thrill of exultation, the joy of knowing that action was close at hand. For deep in him had grown the belief that only through action could Josephine be freed for him. Suddenly, softly, there came floating to him the low, sweet tones of the piano, and then, sweeter still, the voice of Josephine. Another moment and Miriam's voice had joined her in a song whose melody seemed to float like that of spirit voices through the thick fog walls of Adare House. Soundlessly he moved toward the room where they were waiting for him, a deeper flush mounting into his face now. He opened the door without being heard, and looked in. Josephine was at the piano. The great lamp above her head flooded her in a mellow light in which the rich masses of her hair shimmered in a glorious golden glow. His heart beat with the knowledge that she had again dressed for him tonight. Her white neck was bare. In her hair he saw for a second time a red rose. For a space he saw no one but her. Then his eyes turned for an instant to Miriam. She was standing a little back, and it seemed to him that he had never seen her so beautiful. Against the wall in a great chair sat the master of Adare, his bearded chin in the palm of his hand, looking at the two with a steadiness of gaze that was more than adoration. Philip entered. Still he was unheard. He stood silent until the song was finished, and it was Josephine, turning, who saw him first. "Philip!" she cried. Adare started, as if awakening from a dream. Josephine came to Philip, holding out both her hands, her beautiful face smiling with welcome. Even as their warm touch thrilled him, he felt a sudden chill creep over him. A swift glance showed him that Adare had gone to Miriam. Instead of words of greeting, he whispered low in Josephine's ear: "I would have come sooner, but I have been with Jean. He returned a few minutes ago. Strange things have happened, and he says that he must see you within an hour, and that your father must not know. He is in my room. You must get away without rousing suspicion." Her fingers gripped his tightly. The soft glow in her eyes faded away. A look of fear leapt into them, and her face went suddenly white. He drew her nearer until her hands were against his breast. "Don't look like that," he whispered. Nothing can hurt you, nothing in the world. See, I must do this to bring your colour back, or they will guess something is wrong." He bent and kissed her on the lips. Adare's voice burst out happily. "Good boy, Philip! Don't be bashful when we're around. That's the first time I've seen you kiss your wife." There was none of the white betrayal in Josephine's cheeks now. They were the colour of the rose in her hair. She had time to look up into Philip's face, and whisper with a laughing break in her voice: "Thank you, Philip. You have saved me again." With Philip's hand in hers, she turned to her father and mother. "Philip wants to scold me, Mon Pere," she said, "and I cannot blame him. He has seen almost nothing of me to day." "And I have been scolding Miriam because they have given me no chance with the baby," rumbled Adare. "I have seen him but twice to day, the little beggar, and both times he was asleep. But I have forced them to terms, Philip. From to morrow I have to be with him as much as I please. When they want him they will find him in the big room."
Josephine led Philip to her mother, who had seated herself on one of the divans. "I want you to talk with Philip, Mikawe," she said. "I have promised Father that he should have a peep at the baby. I will bring him back very soon." Philip seated himself beside Miriam as Adare and Josephine left the room. He noticed that her hair was dressed like Josephine's, and that in the soft depths of it was partly buried a rose.
"Do you know, I sometimes think I am half dreaming," he said. "All this seems too wonderful to be true. You and Josephine, almost 1,000 miles out of the world. Even flowers like that which you wear in your hair, hothouse flowers." There was a strange sweetness in Miriam's smile, a smile softened by something that was almost pathetic, a touch of sadness. "That is the one thing we keep alive out of the world I used to know, roses," she said. "The first roots came from my babyhood home, and we have grown them here for more than 20 years. Of course Josephine has shown you our little hothouse?" "Yes," lied Philip. Then he added, finding her dear eyes resting on him steadily: "And have you never grown lonesome up here?"
"Never. I am sorry that we ever went back into that other world, even for a day. This has been paradise. We have always been happy. And you?" she asked suddenly. "Do you sometimes wish for that other world?"
"I have been out of it 4 years, with the exception of a short break. I never want to go back. Josephine has made my paradise, as you have made another man's." He fancied, as she turned her face from him, that he heard a little catch in her breath. But she faced him again quickly. "We have been happy. No woman in the world has been happier than I. And you 4 years? In that time have you not heard much music? Shall I play for you?" She rose and went to the piano without waiting for him to reply. Philip leaned back and partly closed his eyes as she began to play. The spell of music held him silent, and neither spoke until Josephine and her father returned. Philip did not catch the laughing words Adare turned to his wife. In the door Josephine had stopped. To his surprise she was dressed in a red coat and hood, and her feet were moccasined. She made a quick little signal to him. "I am ready, Philip," she said. He arose, fearing that his tongue might betray him if he replied to her in words. Adare came unwittingly to his assistance. "You'll get used to this before the winter is over, Philip," he exclaimed banteringly. "Metoosin once called Josephine Wapikunoo, the White Owl, and that name has stuck ever since. I haven't known Mignonne to miss a walk on a moonlit winter night since I can remember. But I prefer my airings in the day. Eh, Miriam?"
"And there is no moon to night," laughed his wife.
"Hush, but there is, Philip," whispered Adare loudly. "It may be that our Josephine will prefer the darker nights after this. Can you remember?"
Josephine was pulling Philip through the door, laughing back over her shoulder. As soon as they were in the hall she caught his arm excitedly. "Let us hurry to your room," she urged. "You can dress up and slip out unseen, leaving Jean and me alone. You are sure he wants to see me alone?" There was a tremble in her voice now.
"Yes."
They came to his door, and he tapped on it lightly. Instantly it was opened. Josephine stared at Jean as she darted in. "Jean, you have something to tell me?" she whispered, no longer hiding the fear in her face. "You must see me alone?"
"Oui, mademoiselle."
murmured Jean, returning to Philip. "If M'sieur Philip can arrange for us to be alone." "I will be gone in a moment," said Philip, hastily beginning to put on heavier garments. "Lock the door, Jean. It will not do to be interrupted now." When he was ready, Josephine went to him, her eyes shining softly. Jean turned to the window. "Your faith in me is beautiful," she said gratefully, so low that only he could hear her. "I don't deserve it, Philip." For a moment he pressed her hand, his face telling her more than he could trust his lips to speak. Jean heard him turn the key in the lock, and he turned quickly. "I thought it would have been better for you to go out by the window, M'sieur." "You are right," agreed Philip, relocking the door. Jean raised the window. As Philip dropped himself outside, the half breed said: "Go no farther than the edge of the forest, M'sieur. We will turn the lights low and draw the curtain. When the curtain is raised again, return to us as quickly as you can. Remember, M'sieur, and go no farther than the edge of the forest." The window dropped behind him, and he turned toward the dark wall of spruce. There were 6 inches of fresh snow on the ground, and the clouds were again drifting out of the sky. Here and there a star shone through, but the moon was only a pallid haze beyond the gray black thickness above. In the first shelter of the spruce and balsam Philip paused. He found himself a seat by brushing the snow from a log, and lighted his pipe. Steadily he kept his eyes on the curtained window. What was happening there now? To what was Josephine listening in these tense minutes of waiting? Even as he stared through the darkness to that one lighter spot in the gloom he knew that the world was changing for the woman he loved. He believed Jean, and he knew Jean was now telling her the story of that day and the preceding night, the story which he had said would destroy the hopes she had built up, throw their plans into ruin, perhaps even disclose to him the secret which they had been fighting to hide. What could that story be? And what effect was it having on Josephine? The minutes passed slowly, with an oppressive slowness. 3 times he lighted matches to look at his watch. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. He rose from the log and paced back and forth, making a beaten path in the snow. It was taking Jean a long time to tell the story. And then suddenly a flood of light shot out into the night. The curtain was raised. It was Jean's signal to him, and with a wildly beating heart he responded to it. Chapter 18.